Hello, everyone. I'm Yeswanth. I'm from First Walk-in Technologies, which is a startup in India. I'm going to talk about two topics majorly. One is React Native Bridge, and another one is push notifications, specifically in Android. As you guys are already aware of, that your React Native consists of the JavaScript world and the native world. In case of Android, the native world is Java, and the bridge is this serial communicator that transfers all your commands from your JavaScript world to the native world, and vice versa. So the bridge is actually written in C++ or Java. So let's look at an example of how it works. So you have three main threads in React Native. Your native components, for example, your button actually lives in the UI thread. When you click the button, it actually sends a message to the JavaScript thread saying, the button is clicked. What should I do? And your JavaScript, basically, you write your code to update your UI. Probably you want to show an animation, or you want to open a pop-up. So your JavaScript thread will then dispatch some, send the message to view manager thread, which will contain view managers that will change the view. And that, again, goes back to the native thread to actually update the UI. So what happens if you have like an animation that you have written in JavaScript where the computation is actually happening in JavaScript? Let's look at that. So you want your animation to be smooth. You don't want them to be jittery. So for your animation to be smooth, you need the changes of your animation to go to the native thread like 60 times per second. And that can cause a problem because the bridge itself, any messages that goes into the bridge needs to be serialized and then deserialized on the other end. So your UI might lag. So there are a couple of solutions that you could actually use. One is the famous animated API from React Native. So this is shipped with React Native, and it's a declarative API to offload all your animations. So what you do is you basically declare your animation, and then you send it to the native world just once, and your native does all the computation as the animation is playing. So there's not much of communication that needs to happen on the bridge. Another use case would be, let's say, your animated API does not solve all your use cases in your app. So you might want to use another API called Interaction Manager. There's a method called run after interactions. So let's say you're transitioning from screen 1 to screen 2, and you need to do some computation on the screen 2 in your JavaScript and keep passing it to the native. You could actually put it inside this block. So what this actually does is it waits for your animations to actually stop, and then it executes your code. So that way the user does not feel that the UI is actually jittery. UI feels much smoother when you do this. I also want to talk about push notifications in Android, because I see a lot of React Native developers just using the very basics of push notifications and not really understanding the system. So I thought I could actually touch upon this. So in push notifications, there are actually two main things. One is the registration, and another is the push notification itself. So for the registration, your app needs to talk to FCM, if in case of Android, like Firebase Cloud Messaging Service. It asks for a token, and the token is, again, received on the mobile or your app end. And this token uniquely identifies your app and your device. So you want to store your token in the backend. And then whenever the backend wants to send a push notification to your app, it could then send a message to FCM to send push notification to your app. All right, let's look at what code do we need to implement. On the JavaScript end, it's basically one few lines of code to actually get the token, and an API call to your backend to actually store the code. Then you might want to process all your notifications that you receive on your JavaScript end. Let's say you want to take the user to a specific screen, or you want to track some metrics that the user has clicked your notification. Another important thing which in the Android world is all your notification rendering is done within your app. It's not done by the OS. So whenever Firebase actually sends a message to your app receives it, and your app creates a notification dialog that you see on your screen. So what that means is you have a lot of control on your Android end. So you can do stuff like grouping notifications. So in case of Gmail app in Android, you have like 3 new messages which where instead of showing 3 different notifications, they have grouped it into one, and you can drag it down to see all the information there. Or you could create like a custom actions. So you could like have buttons there right in your notification itself. So definitely, there are a lot of use cases where you would want to customize the notifications in your Android for your app. And that you could easily do by extending your Firebase messaging service and implementing your own logic for notifications. I also want to talk about, actually, I have like a question for everyone, where how can React Native developers proactively catch up with native SDK changes? And this is from a personal experience that being a React Native developer, I'm not totally aware of what's happening in the native world. So a couple of examples here. Android 26 SDK released something called channels. So your notifications could have different channels that user could choose to show or not. So you could have like a promotional channel, you could have like transactional channel, etc. And if you don't implement like the default channel, Android does not display the notification if your app is using the Android 26 SDK. A second use case, which has been like a problem for me for years, is how to uniquely identify an iOS device. If I release an app on iOS, and if I delete the app and reinstall the app, I get 2 different tokens if I'm using the standard APIs. So there wasn't really a solution from iOS. But recently, from iOS 11, they have released something called iOS Device Check API, which actually persists token till you factory reset your iOS. So it's actually very useful for a lot of business cases where you want to really identify that the user is from the same device. He hasn't uninstalled and installed the app, and so he didn't get like a different token. So reason I brought these 2 examples is to really understand from you guys is what as React Native developers we should do to actually know what's happening in the Android world, because that's something that's shielded from us because of this wonderful thing called React Native. I mean, that's the end of the talk. I'll leave with that. Thank you.